Hello everyone. Following our previous lesson about the context leading up to Alexandra Palace, we're going to be talking about the development of the site itself. So today we're going to talk about how Alexandra Palace grew between the kind of late 1800s and present day. Our starter is to write numbers 1 to 7 down for some quickfire questions, and all of these quickfires are to do with content covered in the previous lesson. Now, if you haven't already watched that video, please head onto the YouTube channel and have a look at that one now. Otherwise, pause the video, write numbers 1 to 7 down for your quickfires, and they'll be playing in just a moment. So, taking a look at our quickfire questions. Number 1, industrial London was anything along the lines of dirty, unsanitary, crowded, filthy, difficult. Any of those synonyms will work for us in this case. This law provided more leisure time for workers. It was the Factory Acts. Number 3, the year of the Great Exhibition was 1851. Audiences would come from long distances away to stare at people who were deformed, disabled, or even possibly foreigners. These were called freak shows. Number 5, it was a music hall originally for 700 people. It expanded to seat 1,500, and we called this Canterbury Hall. Number 6, Victorians believed seaside towns had this power. It was a mystical, magical, healing power. And number 7, railways were originally developed with this purpose in mind, and it was, of course, to move goods from factories. Just to do a quick little memory test, we have 4 questions, all to do with part 1, the historical context. Now, if you have your site study book handy, might be an idea to pause the video now, have a quick skim through to see if we can find the answers to the following questions. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and resume playing the video. So here we are, question number 1. What would set the towns of Britain a-dancing? It was the railway. It was actually Thomas Carlyle. He was a historian and a social commenter, and he was actually really worried about how the railways were going to start to merge different communities together. You can imagine when he was born in the early 1800s, towns and cities were quite separated. And the railways were now linking these together in a much easier way. And he was worried that these towns are just going to be constantly moving and shifting and changing. And that's something that was a little bit worrying to him. Whilst which gave industrial workers a bit more leisure time. Of course, is the Factory Acts. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was held at Crystal Palace, and Queen Victoria's husband's name was Prince Albert. Now to have a look at the building of the palace itself. Owen Jones, he was the man with the plan. He decided to build Alexandra Palace on Tottenham Wood Farm. It was a 250-acre estate about 10 miles north of central London. Now, the name Alexandra Palace actually came from Edward, Prince of Wales, from his wife. Now, Edward was the heir to the British throne at the time, and this was sort of a gesture of good faith to name the palace after his wife. Now, the original designs for the palace were to encourage Victorians to get out of central London, get out of the pollution, into the fresh air. And you'll notice that a lot of the different forms of entertainment on offer are outdoors. So we have a boating lake, walking trails, horse racing track. There was a cycle racing track as well. Indoors, we had the Great Hall, Music Hall, Palm Court, food services. And fire was actually a big concern when the palace was being built. There were 4 towers at the palace which kept water in the event of a fire. Now, to go back to that horse racing track nicknamed the Frying Pan, we actually have an overhead shot of Alexandra Palace today. And here we have the original frying pan. So the start point is here. This is where the horses would line up. And they would race a number of laps around this circle here, and then finish on the finishing straight on this side. So the best spot to be would be kind of watching from maybe here or down at the finish. Now we can actually see on the map here the shape of the original frying pan. So here we have that circle where they would do the laps, and then we can see here where the finishing straight would have been. So this is a shot from Google Images, from Google Earth actually, a couple weeks ago. So still at Alexandra Palace, if you went today, you could see the outlines of where the original horse racing track was. Now to talk about its rise in popularity, we've mentioned in the previous lesson that Victorians were very, very keen for light exercise. It wasn't about getting sweaty and out of breath. It was about to stimulate the body and the mind. Now, to do this, to be able to get to Alexandra Palace, you had to find an efficient way to get there. And the development of the railway network made travel much faster and much easier. Now, London at the time was the very first to have an underground rail system, first country in the entire world to do so. And the way that they would actually accomplish this was by, if we have a flat surface here, they would just dig a massive trench, sort of like this, into the ground. We're talking 20, 30, 40 feet deep, the same kind of width. And they would then build the railway track here, they build the platforms on the side, everything they needed. And when they were finished, they would then cover it back up and build the roads again on top. So rather than simply tunneling, it was much easier to dig these into the earth and then to put a cover back over top. And we can actually see that being done in the image here on the right-hand side. So this whole area has been dug out, and then they've rebuilt the roadways over top. What this did mean for the original tube network, it wasn't that low beneath the ground. We're going 30, 40, maybe 50 feet at most. To be able to get to Alexandra Palace, though, you could use a bit of the underground network. It didn't extend all the way out to Alexandra Palace, but you would have to take trains, and it might take a series of trains to be able to get there depending on where you're leaving from. But in any case, that 10-mile journey, talking anywhere from kind of 25, 30 minutes, maybe up to 45 minutes. So it wasn't a extraordinarily long travel time. It was relatively easy and within reach for most Londoners. Alexandra Park Station opened up in 1873. In the first 2 weeks of it being opened, 124,000 people passed through the barriers there. So that's just showing us how many people are actually traveling to Alexandra Palace, but also how many people are traveling there using the rail network. Very, very few people would have traveled by other means other than using the railway. It's important for us to remember as well, the London North Eastern Railway Company, also known as the LNER, they owned and operated that station. So a significant cost to build that station, but also a significant amount of income going to the LNER through those 124,000 passengers just in the first 2 weeks alone. Now, moving forward in history a little bit, we're going to hit kind of the early 1900s now. We're going to talk about public ownership and the decline of Alexandra Palace. Now, even though 124,000 people visited in the first 2 weeks, the palace wasn't actually making money. And that was simply down to the structure of the palace and how they were charging people to get in, but also due to the high running costs of the palace. Now, if you went to Alexandra Palace, you didn't necessarily have to pay for every single activity. There wasn't payment being taken to go on a nature walk. I mean, if you wanted to hire a boat, you had to pay for that. But to go and watch a horse race, well, you could just watch the horses race. It wouldn't necessarily be a case of having to pay to be able to get in. Where that frying pan racing track was located, you could see it from the hillside. This actually meant the palace was forced to close from 1889 to 1898. And while it was shut, London was growing quite rapidly. We know the Industrial Revolution, people were moving to London, and there was a real lack of housing. And local councils were getting worried that if the palace isn't sorted in terms of its financial issues, parts of the park could be sold off to build houses on. This was a real worry for those local councils. So what they did is the Wood Green Council, the Tottenham Council, Hornsey Council, and the Muswell Hill Council, they all got together in 1901 and said, let's all chip in to buy the palace and to buy the parkland as well. And what that did is it put the park from private ownership into public ownership. And the reason this is really important for us to remember is this secured the future of Alexandra Palace. It meant that those local councils would have no interest in selling off the land to be used for housing or other developments. They would keep it as the palace. Now, between 1914 and 1918, the palace was shut for the First World War. People were off fighting. They were working in factories. No one was really concerned with going to Alexandra Palace during those war years. And it reopened finally in 1921. Now, 5 years later, the BBC turned up. They would stay there until 1980. We talked about Muffin the Mule, the Quartermass experiment, and the news being filmed here at Alexandra Palace. But that kind of led to its decline because we saw taste and leisure change after the Second World War, and people stopped visiting the palace. The railway network was removed to Alexandra Palace in 1970 because people were typically doing other things. Rather than going to Alexandra Palace, we know that people prefer to go to the south of Spain, perhaps the south of France, by utilizing those budget airlines like EasyJet or Ryanair. Now, by 1981, there's a fire. The palace is going to remain closed for the next 7 years until 1988. Although much of the palace was destroyed, the original structure, this actually gave people an opportunity to renovate and to update the palace. And things like an ice skating rink, they were added that previously didn't exist at Alexandra. So we've got a couple of tasks to do. It's really helpful if you have your site study book with you at this point. Your job is to read The Palace for the People, highlight any information you can find about Tottenham Wood Farm, the 1873 fire, anything to do with entertainment or leisure at Alexandra Palace. Carry on reading about the railway access and leisure facilities. And again, highlight anything you find about how the railway changed visitors to Alexandra Palace, or what visitors could do when they expected, or what they could expect to do, when they went to the palace. Have a look at the public ownership in BBC broadcasting. Any challenges that face the private owners of the palace, mainly those economic issues, you can highlight those. And also have a look at the BBC's role in kind of reestablishing a bit of success at Alexandra Palace between 1926 and kind of the 1970s. And lastly, have a look at post-war decline and fire and restoration, and anything you can find about the 1981 fire, go ahead and highlight in your book, and anything that happened in Britain after World War II that led to the decline of Alexandra Palace. Again, thinking about things like Button and Skegness, thinking about those budget airlines as well. Once you finish with that, you can go ahead and hit play on the video, and we're going to take a look at a couple of tasks to complete. So a great way to summarize our knowledge is to look at completing tasks 4, 5, and 6 in your booklets. What we'll do is we can pause the video now, have a look through the booklets. Your job is to find some features of Alexandra Palace. Task 4 is really helpful with your question 6A. Find information about the boating lake, the Great Hall, Palm Court, railway access. Likewise, have a look at task 5 to explain how the BBC played an important role in preserving Alexandra Palace in the mid-20th century. So we'll pause the video now, have a look at completing those, and when you're finished, you can resume playing to look at the correct responses. So here we are, we have the boating lake. You could hire a boat to paddle around for a while. These weren't motorboats, they had oars that were given to you. You can kind of paddle around the lake for half an hour, depending on how long you wanted to go for. But this was believed to stimulate the body and the mind. And again, it's another example of that light exercise. The Great Hall, every palace had a Great Hall, every castle had a Great Hall. It was normally at the heart of the palace. It was a big room, high ceilings. It's where you would have meals and banquets and put on performances. This was a place that Alexandra Palace could actually be hired out for private functions, but also a place for people to go and visit. Palm Court, we know we talked about this glass dome that had exotic plants that were not necessarily native to Britain. The Elizabethans, they grew pineapples at Dorneycourt using very similar methods in the 1500s we talked about. And the railway access, we know that Alexandra Park Station opened in 1871. The palace itself opened in 1873. And this was mainly to ensure that transport links were available for people to get to Alexandra Palace. And we talked about those large numbers of passengers who were arriving there, 124,000 in the first 2 weeks. Now, taking a look at question 5 to explain how the BBC played an important role in the palace. Well, there were several ways they did this kind of after World War II and into kind of the late 1970s, really. During the Second World War, we know Alexandra Palace was used to interfere with German bombers. So this was how radio signals could be sent up to those bombers to try to interfere with their own signals, to hopefully throw them off of targets. But after the war, Muffin the Mule was filmed there. We know the news was filmed there as well, Quartermass Experiment. The coronation of Elizabeth II was broadcast in 1953 with parts of her ceremony actually being recorded in the palace itself. This brought a lot of interest to the palace, and people decided to go visit because, of course, they saw the coronation. They wanted to see the site of that coronation. The Quartermass Experiment we mentioned as well. That was filmed until 1956. The BBC also broadcast important news stories from Alexandra Palace. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, we've talked about in our USA unit, coverage of the Vietnam War, and programs for the Open University were filmed there. By the 1970s, Alexandra Palace was hosting the World Darts Tournament. It had actually the best high-definition television technology at the time, was actually present at Alexandra Palace. And that was bringing broadcasts of cricket matches, football matches to millions and millions of homes across the country. So the last little bit for us to look at is the final summary bit in our Unit 2 of our site study. So use the summary notes page to record any key observations, important points. It could be planning a question 6A or a 6B, and just double check that your glossary terms for this part of the unit are also completed.